My friends, when an American businessman lands in Singapore in 2025, he steps out of Changi Airport, looks around, and says, wait a second. This isn't Asia. This is the future. He takes a photo of the automated immigration gates, the zero-litter roads, the driverless buses, the spotless skyline, and then he whispers to his friend, how did they do this so fast? That's the question the world is asking right now. Because to most outsiders, Singapore looks like a miracle that happened overnight. But to those who've lived here, it's not a miracle. It's a 50-year lesson in discipline, clarity, and courage. I've been telling people for years the world changes quietly. And then suddenly, Singapore is proof. When I talk to my friends in America, they're shocked. They say, Jack, we used to visit Singapore for business conferences. Now it feels like we're visiting to learn survival. And I tell them, that's because Singapore stopped chasing growth and started designing it. You see, the biggest difference between East and West today is this: Americans dream big, but Asians plan long. America says, let's move fast and break things. Singapore says, let's move right and fix things. And in 2025, that difference has never been clearer. When the US debates its economy, Singapore executes its next phase. While Washington argues, Singapore builds. While others talk about AI regulation, Singapore has already trained its citizens to work with AI. This is what shocks the world. Not technology, but tempo. Singapore is moving at a rhythm that even big nations can't keep up with. The Americans look at Singapore and say, you're too small to matter. But in 2025, that smallness became the secret weapon. When you're small, you can adapt faster. You don't need to convince 50 states to agree. You just decide, commit, and deliver. And that's why Singapore has become the world's most efficient experiment in progress. Let me tell you what's happening behind the scenes. In the last decade, Singapore turned itself into a living lab for everything: smart energy grids, digital trade, fintech, medical tech, and now green AI. It's not just building technology, it's building trust with technology. When a Singaporean government portal says your document will be ready in 24 hours, you don't laugh, you expect it. That's trust. When you walk into an MRT station and see zero chaos, zero graffiti, and zero excuses, that's not luck. That's culture. Americans can't believe it because in their world, freedom means doing what you want. In Singapore, freedom means doing what's right. And that mindset, that quiet, disciplined freedom, has built something that the West can't copy easily: predictable excellence. You see, success isn't about how big you are. It's about how consistent you are. The United States has size. Singapore has system. And systems always win in the long run. When I first came to Singapore years ago, I was amazed not by the skyscrapers, but by the silence. The streets were calm, organized, disciplined. You could feel that invisible energy, a kind of collective agreement that said, we take ourselves seriously. That's the foundation of transformation. You don't change the world by shouting louder. You change it by working smarter. And Singapore has mastered that art. Now, when Americans look at Singapore's success, they call it overnight. But the truth is, it took half a century of sleepless nights. You can't see the planning meetings, the policies rewritten 100 times, the arguments about long-term goals. You only see the results. And that's why they call it overnight. But nothing real happens overnight. It happens quietly while the world is distracted. When America was building apps, Singapore was building accountability. When others were fighting for political points, Singapore was investing in public trust. That's why in 2025, the world is waking up to something I've been saying for years. The future doesn't belong to the loudest. It belongs to the most reliable. Reliability is Singapore's brand. Think about it. Every investor who sets up here knows exactly what to expect. Taxes are transparent, laws are clear, corruption is nearly non-existent. That's what attracts the world's capital. People don't bring their money to where it's the cheapest. They bring it to where it's the safest. That's why Singapore's tiny land produces massive confidence. And confidence, my friends, is a currency more powerful than dollars. When Americans come here and see how things run, trains on time, rules enforced, policies respected, they ask, don't people get tired of so many rules? And I smile. Because discipline isn't restriction. It's protection. Rules don't limit progress. They sustain it. The problem in many countries, even in the West, is that freedom became confusion. People wanted rights without responsibility. Singapore chose a harder path, responsibility before rights. And that's why today it stands taller than its size. But don't think Singapore is perfect. No country is. The cost of living is high. The pressure to perform is heavy. The pace is relentless. But people accept that pressure because they see purpose behind it. They trust that their effort will be rewarded fairly. And that's something money can't buy. Trust in fairness. In America, people fight for change. In Singapore, people follow through on change. One values expression, the other values execution. And in 2025, the world is learning that execution is the new innovation because ideas are everywhere. Discipline is rare. And that's why the world is now paying attention. Let me share a story. An American tech CEO visited Singapore early this year. After a few days, he told me, Jack, this city runs like software, no bugs. I laughed and said, yes, because they debug themselves daily. That's the truth. Singapore constantly upgrades its systems, not only its machines, from education to immigration, from healthcare to housing. Everything is measured, refined, improved. That's why when the pandemic hit years ago, Singapore didn't panic. It executed. When global inflation came, it adjusted. When AI disrupted industries, it retrained its people before the disruption arrived. This is not luck, it's foresight. And that's the part Americans can't believe, that a small country without resources could plan better than those with trillions. But planning doesn't need money. It needs mindset. Singapore's government doesn't waste time arguing about yesterday. It builds for tomorrow. That's what leadership means. To think decades ahead while solving today. Now, some people ask me, Jack, why do you keep praising Singapore so much? Are you saying Asia is better than America? No. I'm saying Asia is finally being understood. For decades, the West told Asia to learn efficiency, democracy, and innovation. Now the tables have turned. The world is learning discipline, patience, and purpose from Asia. America taught the world how to start. Singapore is teaching the world how to sustain. The shock Americans feel isn't about Singapore's buildings or GDP. It's about its belief. The belief that small nations can lead with big values. Because in the end, progress isn't about size. It's about sincerity. Let me tell you something about sincerity. When a government tells its people, we'll make your life better, and it actually delivers, that's sincerity in action. When a company promises its customers honesty and keeps it for years, that's how trust is born. And Singapore's progress is built entirely on that. A consistent promise kept for half a century. That's what I call invisible leadership. The kind that doesn't need to shout because results do the talking. But the reason Americans are shocked is deeper. It's not just that Singapore became rich. It's that Singapore became relevant. In global conversations about AI, trade, climate, and digital trust, Singapore now sits at the adult table. It's no longer seen as a follower, but as a thinker. And that changes everything. When the world starts asking you for advice, you know your foundation was strong. America, with all its power, is now watching Singapore's experiments in digital governance, green finance, and AI ethics. Because the future isn't about who controls data, it's about who uses it wisely. And wisdom, unlike technology, cannot be imported. It must be cultivated. That's why Singapore is ahead. It invested in wisdom, not just hardware. From education systems that teach adaptability to public policies that encourage long-term thinking, everything here prepares people for change, not just comfort. I tell my entrepreneur friends this all the time. Success isn't built on perfection. It's built on preparation. Singapore prepared when no one was watching. And that's what makes its 2025 transformation so powerful. It looks sudden, but it was slow and steady all along. The Americans are shocked because they missed the buildup. They didn't see the years of quiet reforms, the emphasis on education, the obsession with accountability. They just saw the results, and now they call it overnight. But the lesson here is universal. The world rewards those who prepare before the spotlight arrives. And that's what Singapore did better than anyone else. So, when people ask me, Jack, what's the real secret behind Singapore's success? I always say, the secret is there's no secret. Just systems that work. In a noisy world, that's revolutionary. When governments everywhere chase popularity, Singapore chased productivity. When leaders everywhere made promises, Singapore made policies. And that's the reason the Americans are shocked, because Singapore made excellence normal. They're shocked not because of what Singapore built, but because of what it didn't break. Its trust, its unity, its standards. And that, my friends, is the biggest compliment a country can receive. The next time an American comes to Singapore and says, wow, this city is amazing. Remember, it wasn't magic. It was management. And management comes from mindset. The mindset that says, we may be small, but we can be precise. We may have limits, but we will outthink them. We may not control the world, but we will control ourselves. That's what makes Singapore unstoppable. Because discipline is destiny. And that's what the world is finally learning. That success without structure collapses and freedom without focus fades. The real question now is not how Singapore changed, but whether it can stay this sharp, this humble, and this united as the world's eyes turn toward it. Because when the world starts praising you, that's when you must become even more disciplined. That's the beginning of the next challenge, and that's what I'll talk about next. You know, I've met many American executives who still can't understand what happened. They ask, Jack, how did Singapore pull this off? How did a city smaller than some of our suburbs become an economic superpower? And I always smile and tell them, because you were looking for money. Singapore was looking for meaning. That's the first big difference between how the West and Asia see growth. For decades, the Western world believed success came from size. More land, more people, more resources, more spending. But Singapore believes success comes from clarity. Clearer systems, clearer goals, clearer values. While America was chasing quarterly profits, Singapore was planning quarter centuries. You see, the West loves to innovate. That's their greatest strength. But innovation without discipline is like a rocket without a direction. It goes fast, but not always forward. Singapore built the direction first. It's not flashy. It's not noisy, but it's focused. And focus beats force every time. When I was in California last year, a friend told me, Jack, in America, we move fast because we have competition. In Singapore, you move smart because you have coordination. That sentence stayed in my mind. It explained everything. Competition without coordination creates chaos. Coordination without competition creates comfort. But when you balance both, you create consistency. And consistency builds empires. That's what Singapore has done. In America, people build brands. In Singapore, they build systems. And a system lasts longer than any brand. Now, don't misunderstand me. America is still an incredible nation. Its creativity, its openness, its courage to take risks. The world needs that. But what America got wrong was thinking that success means loudness. In Asia, we know success means quiet excellence. The Western world celebrates personalities. The Eastern world celebrates processes. That's why Americans are surprised, because Singapore doesn't brag, it performs. It doesn't announce transformation, it practices it. In 2025, when Americans visit Singapore, they see technology that works. They see housing policies that actually help people. They see public transport that respects time. And they think, how did you get everyone to agree to this level of discipline? The answer is simply trust. Trust is Singapore's hidden superpower. People trust their government because the government earned it. Investors trust the system because the rules don't change overnight. Students trust education because it connects to real opportunities. Trust is the real infrastructure of progress. It's invisible, but it supports everything. When Americans talk about innovation, they talk about funding. When Singapore talks about innovation, it talks about foundation. That's why even with limited resources, Singapore keeps surprising the world. And this is where the lesson lies for everyone, especially the rest of Asia. You don't need to copy America's scale to succeed. You need to master your own structure. When the West built its dominance, the world had no internet, no globalization, no AI. Today's world is different. Speed is nothing without stability. And stability is what Asia, and especially Singapore, is showing right now. And here comes the warning. Stability can easily turn into stagnation if you forget how you started. Success is like sugar. Sweet at first, but dangerous if you consume too much. Singapore's greatest challenge now is not competition from America or China. It's comfort. When you reach the top, the biggest threat is not failure, it's pride. Many nations fall not because they lose wars, but because they lose humility. And this, my friends, is what America got wrong. Decades ago, America was admired not just for its wealth, but for its work ethic. People there worked hard, built industries, dreamed big. But as time passed, success turned into entitlement. People stopped building and started blaming. They assumed their leadership was permanent. And the world moved on. Now, the same warning goes to Singapore. Don't let the world's praise make you soft. Don't let efficiency become arrogance. Don't let perfection become pressure that kills creativity. Because every system, no matter how perfect, needs renewal. The danger of being too organized is that you might stop improvising. Innovation doesn't come from comfort. It comes from curiosity. If Singapore wants to stay ahead, it must protect its curiosity, the same curiosity that made it great in the first place. When America stopped asking questions, it started losing answers. So here's my warning. The next 10 years will not reward those who are perfect. They will reward those who are adaptable. Singapore's real test begins now. Can it evolve from a nation of discipline into a nation of daring? Can it move from managing order to mastering imagination? Because if it can, it will not just shock Americans, it will inspire the world. But if it becomes satisfied with being the best small country, it will slowly fade while others catch up. That's how the world works. Yesterday's leaders become tomorrow's history when they stop upgrading their mindset. The real competition now is not between America and Singapore. It's between yesterday's Singapore and tomorrow's Singapore. When I speak to young Singaporeans, I tell them, your parents built safety. You must build creativity, because safety without creativity becomes limitation, and creativity without structure becomes chaos. The secret is balance. That's what Asia needs to learn, not to copy the West, but to blend the best of both worlds. Learn America's spirit of risk-taking. Keep Singapore's spirit of responsibility. When these two forces unite, they create unstoppable growth. America builds dreams. Asia builds discipline. But the future belongs to those who can do both. Dream responsibly. That's what I call the new Asian model of success. It's not East versus West anymore. It's excellence versus excuses. If you look at the world in 2025, you'll see this clearly. the countries that prepared long before crisis hit. Singapore, South Korea, parts of China, even Vietnam, are now leading in innovation, logistics, and education. Meanwhile, countries that waited for someone else to fix their problems are struggling. The difference is not technology. It's timing. And Singapore's timing was perfect because it never stopped preparing. When the rest of the world was celebrating past achievements, Singapore was building future systems. That's what leadership looks like. Preparation in silence, progress in action. Now, let's talk about what shocks Americans most. It's not Singapore's skyline or technology. It's the culture of accountability. In many Western systems, accountability means punishment. In Singapore, it means improvement. When a mistake happens here, it's analyzed, not politicized. That's why Singapore keeps moving forward while others get stuck debating who to blame. Because the goal is not to win arguments, it's to win results. And that's a mindset the entire world needs to learn. If America had Singapore's discipline and Singapore had America's creativity, imagine the balance. That's the future Asia must aim for. Discipline with imagination. But here's another warning. Singapore's order must never kill its originality. The next generation must dare to question respectfully, innovate fearlessly, and dream differently. Rules should guide, not cage. Systems should support, not suffocate, because too much control creates compliance, not creativity. And creativity is the fuel of the new economy. I've seen this in Alibaba. When we grew too organized, innovation slowed. We had to remind ourselves to stay messy sometimes, to allow mistakes, to give freedom. That's what kept us alive. Singapore will face the same challenge. The next wave of growth will not come from better rules. It will come from bolder ideas. That's why I say that 2025 shock isn't just for Americans. It's a wake-up call for Singapore itself. The world is watching. Everyone admires your order. But will you now dare to lead in imagination? Because when everyone copies your system, you must invent the next one. In life, success is never final. The moment you say, we made it, you begin to lose it. The secret is to stay hungry even when you're full. Stay curious even when you're praised. Stay humble even when you're number one. That's what keeps nations young. Look at America. It's rediscovering humility now. After decades of dominance, it's realizing that no one stays on top forever. And that realization, painful as it is, might save it. Singapore should learn from that because history repeats itself, especially for those who think it won't. So, to my Singaporean friends, remember, your success is not your shield, it's your responsibility. The world doesn't envy you. It expects you to lead. And leadership means constant evolution. If Singapore continues to blend structure with soul, efficiency with empathy, it will stay not only rich, but relevant. But if it becomes too proud of being the model city, it might turn into a museum, beautiful, admired, but frozen in time. And that would be the real tragedy. Because Singapore's power has never been in its wealth, it's been in its willingness to change. That's why I call 2025 the turning mirror. The world sees Singapore and admires it, but Singapore must also look at itself and ask, are we still growing or just glowing? Because glowing fades, growing lasts. America's shock should not make Singapore celebrate, it should make it reflect. Every compliment is a test. Every praise is a pressure. So, as Americans look at Singapore with surprise, Singapore must look at itself with honesty. That's the only way to keep winning. The world will continue to change. AI, automation, aging, inequality, all these will challenge even the best systems. Singapore's next greatness will not come from copying what worked, but from creating what's next. And that's why I say America's disbelief is just the first chapter. The real story begins when Singapore starts teaching the world not just how to manage success, but how to renew it. Because the true test of excellence is not how fast you rise, but how long you remain worthy of being followed. Singapore has already proven it can rise. Now it must prove it can evolve. That's the 2025 warning, not a threat, but a truth. Success is rented, not owned. And the rent is due every day. Pay it with humility. Pay it with effort. Pay it with innovation. That's how greatness stays alive. And if Singapore remembers that the next time an American lands here and says, "This looks like the future," you can smile and say, "Yes. And we're already building the next one." When I travel across Asia today, I see something powerful happening. The world used to call this region emerging. Now it calls it essential. Singapore's rise is not just its own victory. It's a signal for all of Asia. It shows what happens when you combine long-term vision with short-term execution. It proves that small nations can achieve big dreams if they think clearly and act consistently. But the question is, what comes next? Because every success story has a second chapter, and that second chapter decides whether the success becomes history or legacy. Singapore has reached a point where it's no longer fighting to survive. It's fighting to stay meaningful. That's a harder battle. Survival makes you strong. Comfort makes you slow. And slowing down is dangerous when the world is speeding up. The next decade will test Singapore more than the last 5 combined, not because of enemies, but because of evolution. Technology is changing faster than policies can adapt. People are expecting more than systems can deliver. And the gap between progress and pressure is widening. So the real challenge is not whether Singapore can stay rich. It's whether it can stay relevant. Relevance is the new currency of nations. You can have the best infrastructure, the cleanest streets, the most advanced tech, but if your people lose meaning, your momentum will fade. That's what America is feeling today. It built wealth, but lost unity. It built innovation, but lost inspiration. It became advanced, but not aligned. Singapore must never walk that path. If America's story is about power and China's story is about scale, Singapore's story must remain about precision, the power of small done right. That's what makes this nation different. It doesn't waste. It doesn't overpromise. It doesn't get distracted. That focus is its superpower. But here's the warning. Focus must evolve into foresight. The problems of the next era won't be solved by efficiency alone. They'll be solved by empathy, creativity, and collaboration. In 2025, the world is asking new questions. How do we balance growth with well-being? How do we use AI without losing humanity? How do we build economies that serve people, not the other way around? These are not engineering questions. They're ethical questions. And that's where Singapore can lead next. Not just as a financial hub, but as a moral hub. The place where technology meets trust. The place where data meets dignity. The place where governance meets grace. That's the leadership the world is missing right now. Big countries argue about dominance. Small countries wait for directions. But Singapore can guide through example. It can show that leadership is not about loudness. It's about logic. Not about slogans. It's about systems. And not about perfection. It's about progress. The reason Americans are shocked is not because Singapore overtook them in wealth. It's because it overtook them in wisdom. Think about it. In a world where politics divides nations, Singapore unites. Where others manipulate fear, Singapore manages facts. Where others shout for freedom, Singapore quietly practices responsibility. That's why the world respects it. Respect built through results is stronger than respect built through rhetoric. The Americans can't believe how much can be achieved when leadership is stable, when corruption is punished, and when citizens are trusted to be part of progress. That's the real formula behind Singapore's success. But even this model must grow. The new Singapore can't just be about governance. It must be about generation. The next generation must feel ownership, not obligation. They must build not because they have to, but because they want to. That emotional shift will decide the future. When young people start building out of love, not duty, a nation's growth becomes unstoppable. And Malaysia, its neighbor, can benefit too. Because Singapore's rise should not be Malaysia's insecurity. It should be Malaysia's inspiration. Asia grows faster when its neighbors rise together. Competition is good, but collaboration is greater. What Singapore achieved through systems, Malaysia can achieve through creativity. What Singapore refined through control, Malaysia can enrich through culture. When both cooperate, Southeast Asia becomes a force the world can't ignore. I always tell leaders, the future of Asia depends not on rivalry, but on rhythm. Each country must play its own instrument, but together they must create harmony. Singapore is the melody of discipline. Malaysia is the rhythm of heart. Combine them, and you get music the world will listen to. That's the Asian way, not domination, but balance. The West taught us ambition. The East must now teach wisdom, because ambition without wisdom is how empires fall. America's warning to Singapore is hidden inside its own story. Don't let innovation outgrow integrity. Don't let profit outrun purpose. Don't let technology erase empathy. Singapore can avoid these traps by remembering that progress is not about more. It's about meaning. Meaning is what people crave in 2025. They don't just want higher salaries. They want higher satisfaction. They don't just want smart cities. They want soulful communities. Singapore has the power to lead this next transformation where quality of life becomes the new measure of success. The city of tomorrow won't be defined by skyscrapers, but by smiles, not by data, but by dignity. That's how the next chapter of greatness will be written. I believe Asia's greatest contribution to the world won't be products. It will be perspective. The perspective that humanity comes before hierarchy, that patience beats pressure, that quiet strength outlasts loud chaos. The West has taught the world how to grow. Now Asia must teach the world how to sustain. And Singapore, with its discipline, humility, and foresight, can be that teacher. But remember, this teachers must also keep learning. Singapore must keep learning. The danger of admiration is complacency. When everyone tells you how great you are, you start believing you have nothing left to improve. That's when decline begins. That's why I say Singapore must remain the student of its own success. Study yourself, criticize yourself, and keep upgrading. That's what keeps excellence alive. Excellence is not a destination. It's a decision you make every morning. It's the promise you renew every day. Singapore has kept that promise for 50 years. If it keeps it for 50 more, it won't just be admired, it will be immortalized. But that requires courage. The courage to reinvent while you're still winning. Most people only change after failure. Great nations change before they fail. So, to every Singaporean listening, this is your responsibility now. The world is watching you, not because of what you've achieved, but because of what you represent. You represent the possibility that systems can work. You represent the proof that good governance can coexist with innovation. You represent the idea that discipline doesn't kill creativity, it protects it. Hold on to that identity. Guard it. Nurture it. And then evolve it. Because leadership is not about repeating success. It's about redefining it. The next generation of Singaporeans must lead not just through rules, but through relevance. They must show that even in a digital world, integrity still matters. That in an AI age, humanity is still the greatest intelligence. When Americans visit Singapore again in 2030, I hope they'll say, this city didn't just stay ahead, it stayed awake. Because staying awake is harder than staying ahead. It means never assuming, never settling, never losing the hunger to improve. You see, the real competition is not between countries. It's between versions of ourselves. The old world competed for land. The new world competes for learning. The old world wanted control. The new world needs creativity. Singapore can lead this new race by showing how structure and imagination can work together. And here's the truth. The Americans didn't expect to learn from Asia. Success doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. It whispers through punctual trains, clean streets, fair systems, honest leadership, and quiet confidence. It whispers through children who dream without fear. That whisper is Singapore's power, and the world is finally listening. But even as you inspire others, never forget your roots. Singapore was built not by wealth, but by will, by leaders who dared to dream when there was nothing, by citizens who worked together when everything felt impossible. That spirit must never fade, because when memory fades, mission fails. So my message to Singapore is simply stay humble, stay human, and stay hungry. Humble enough to keep learning, human enough to care, hungry enough to keep building. That's the triangle of timeless growth. If you protect those three values, no shock, American or otherwise, can shake you. Because systems built on sincerity never collapse. They evolve. And that's my final thought tonight. The world doesn't need more powerful nations. It needs more purposeful nations. Singapore's journey proves that purpose can build power, but power without purpose destroys it. The West built its power on innovation. Singapore built its power on intention. Now the two must work together, not against each other. Because the world can't survive another century of division. It needs demonstration. A demonstration of how nations can learn from one another instead of competing to be superior. Imagine a future where America's creativity meets Asia's consistency, where Western passion meets Eastern patience, where countries stop arguing about who's right and start asking what's right. That's the kind of world we can build if we listen to each other. And I believe Singapore can be that bridge, the bridge between ambition and balance, between freedom and focus, between speed and stability. The world doesn't need another superpower. It needs a super example. So when Americans say, why can't believe how Singapore changed overnight? You can answer, it didn't change overnight. It just never stopped changing. That's the secret the world is finally discovering. In the end, nations rise not because of miracles, but because of mindsets. Singapore's mindset turned limitation into leadership, and that mindset can inspire millions across Asia. It proves that even in a noisy world, quiet excellence still wins. To everyone watching, remember this truth: your country's future doesn't depend on its size. It depends on its standards. Your success doesn't depend on your resources. That's the wisdom the West is learning now. And that's why in 2025, the world looks east not out of curiosity, but out of respect. So keep building, keep improving, keep leading with humility. Because the moment you stop improving, you stop inspiring. And the world needs your inspiration more than ever. Thank you to everyone who believes in progress built on principle, in success built on sincerity, and in nations that lead through example. Singapore's journey reminds us all that greatness doesn't begin with resources. It begins with responsibility. And as we move into this new era of transformation, may we all remember the future doesn't belong to the loudest voices. It belongs to the most consistent actions. Singapore didn't talk about the future. It became it. And now the rest of us must catch up. Thank you. My friends, when people ask me, Jack, which country do you think is ahead of the rest of the world? Most expect me to say America, or maybe China, maybe even India today. But let me surprise you. It's not always the biggest that lead. Sometimes it's the smallest. And in this case, it's Singapore. I know for some of you, this sounds strange. How can a country so small, with no natural resources, with barely 6 million people, be ahead of giants like America, China, or Europe? But the truth is not about size. The truth is about strategy, foresight, and discipline. And in these areas, Singapore is at least 10 years ahead of the rest of the world. Let me explain. First, think about planning. Most countries plan around elections. 4 years, 5 years, short-term cycles. They ask, What can I give the people today to win votes tomorrow? That's politics. But Singapore is different.